Good. Okay, so hi, I'm Jeremy Varon, and I'm honored to be your host for tonight's event, which is a live panel discussion as part of the 20 Years Later, a 9/11 Peace and Justice Film Festival. The film festival has been organized by September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, and it features an array of wonderful movies on such topics as torture and Guantanamo, struggles over the 9/11 Memorial Museum, and the plight of 9/11 families like Peaceful Tomorrow's Seeking Peace. Tonight, our focus will be one film, We Are Many, about the historic February 2003 protest against the looming war in Iraq, in which between 15 and 30 million people in hundreds of cities across the world turned out protesting the war. We're thrilled to have tonight the director and the executive producer of the documentary, as well as one of the people featured in it, Colleen Kelly from Peaceful Tomorrows, a veteran profiled in the movie, might join us later. We hope he makes it on. Our hope is for a wide-ranging discussion that looks at the movie, but more broadly, the legacy of both the war on terror and the movement against it. In terms of format, I'll say a bit more about myself, a little bit about the film, then I will invite the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the questions. So with that as the template, let me begin. Again, I'm Jeremy Varon. I'm a professor of history at the New School in New York City. I'm also a longstanding member of a group called Witness Against Torture, which works to close Guantanamo and end US torture. In the context of that work, I got to know Kelly and other Peaceful Tomorrows members. We share the same, activist space, and it's a group and individuals whom I deeply, deeply admire. I consider them really some of the sort of moral heroes of the early 21st century. In addition, I'm writing a book on domestic resistance to America's post 9/11 wars. And in the context of that research, I saw the wonderful movie We Are Many, which I've now watched many times and shown to students in courses on the war on terror and resistance to it. I hope you've seen the movie. If you have, you will surely agree with me that it shows with stunning power all at once the global outrage at a war that seemed to make no sense politically, morally, and strategically, the grand hope felt in the UK, the United States, and in many other countries that the teeming masses in the streets of the world on February 15th could possibly stop this war before it started. Then it shows the crushing disappointment when war breaks out and hopes for peace are dashed. And finally, it captures that weird sense amongst the war's opponents of feeling vindicated by the tragedy that unfolded in Iraq, while at the same time recognizing that the cost in blood and trust and treasure was so great that this hardly feels like victory. Let me say that the political content and historical content of the movie is wonderful, but it's also a brilliant piece of documentary filmmaking with captivating personalities, beautiful pacing, wonderfully brisk storytelling that tells a complex narrative with a certain compactness and efficiency. And it also looks gorgeous, from the cinematography to the amazing animated graphics that help underscore, certain points. So I've always been eager to pay that compliment to people directly involved with the film. So there it is. So with that, I would like to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. Looking at my screen, let's start with Wael Kabbani, then we'll move to Amir and then Colleen.
Hi, my name is Wael Kabbani. I'm a music and film producer, songwriter, and storyteller. I'm the founder and executive creative director of Iambic Dream Films and Iambic Dream Inc., independent production companies that produce now critically acclaimed and award-winning music, film, and animation. I am, as Jeremy may have mentioned, one of the executive producers of We Are Many, and Iambic Dream Films co-produced the film.
Amir, I think you're next.
Yeah, am I meant? Okay.
Yes, hi. I'm Amir Amirani. I'm the producer and director of We Are Many. Um, I'm Iranian. I came to England at the age of 9, and I have studied different subjects, biology and international relations, where I had my first sort of interest in politics. I then went into television, worked for a number of years for the BBC in-house, and then outside of it, independently making films on a number of different topics, arts and music and history. And also on 9/11, just after 9/11, I was asked by the BBC to make a documentary called Letter to America. So my kind of involvement with that sort of story of 9/11 and the 20 years began at that point. But when I came to make We Are Many in 2003, and we might talk about it in more detail, it was because I was on the demonstration myself, and I'm sure it'll come up and I can talk about how that led me to make the film, which took 9 years from the first interview to it being in cinemas. That's a story in itself, both in terms of why that took so long, but also the significance of it for the film, which again might come up. So that's me.
Great, thank you. Colleen?
Hi, I'm Colleen Kelly. I'm a family nurse practitioner and I live and work in the Bronx in New York City. I have most of my adult life dipped my toes into the pool of activism and was involved in various issues in the Bronx for many years. But on September 11th, my brother, Bill Kelly Jr., was by chance at the World Trade Center at a breakfast meeting at Windows of the World. And as with many, many, many other people, his death changed my life. And what was waiting now became a full dive into activism and to seeking some sense of accountability and justice, not only for Bill's death, but in everything that has happened since in the world. So thank you. I'm really excited about today's panel and love the movie.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. So let me begin with a question both for Wael and Amir, which is, why was it so important to you at the time to make this film? And it sounds like it was an arduous process. And why does the film matter today, 20 years out from 9/11, in the wake of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Who would you like to go first? Sure.
You're both so polite. Amir, you begin.
Well, before I begin, firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to September 11 Families for organizing this festival and having us be honored to be part of this, and to Jeremy for agreeing to host. So like I said, I went on the demonstration and it was a striking experience. I hadn't been in anything so big in my life, really. And I think it was probably the first large political demonstration like that. And I knew that the protest was in the air. And when I came back to London, I was in Berlin, actually, as it happens. I noticed something striking, that there were a lot of people who were sort of telling me in very excited tones, you know, my God, you don't know what you missed. There was an amazing thing here. And I said, well, it was, pretty huge in Berlin. And they said, no, it was on a whole different sort of scale. So firstly, seeing people I didn't expect to be excited about protest was interesting. People who I don't think had been on, protest before. And then the scale of it. And then my own reaction, that I felt like I'd missed out on something historic, were all telling. When I put that together with what I'd seen in Berlin, it made me realize that, something was going on here. And then when it became an itch that I kept scratching, and, it seemed to portend something. And when I looked into it and realized that actually this thing was global in hundreds of cities around the world, the penny sort of dropped, and I thought, wow, this is probably the biggest protest in history. And immediately, as a filmmaker, I thought, there's a story here. How does something like this happen? It doesn't just happen, and it probably means something. And so it on one level, it was just purely intriguing. I wanted to know who organized it, whose original idea was it? How does something go from being an idea to something that, you know, reaches 15, 30 million people on one day? And then it was the kind of concept of how do you tell such a huge story involving, you know, tens of millions of people and personalize it through, you know, a smaller number of people, a fraction of those people, and still make it compelling and relevant. So it was kind of a filmmaking challenge. And then after a while, because it took so long, it felt like it wasn't something that I just wanted to make, that I needed to make. It needed to be effectively a historic document. And it came to the point where I thought, well, you know, if I don't do this, will somebody do it? I don't know. And I'm glad that I did do it. And I think that, again, it's a topic that might come up, you know, 20 years on, there's a certain amount of rewriting of history and reversion, or, you know, revising of history. And at least with the film, it will be hard to dispute the scale of the global opposition to the war. And so in a way, that's why it's relevant now. So those were the reasons why I felt I had to make it. And it's important now because it cannot be disputed now.
Thanks so much, Wael.
For me, it was important, you know, to help Amir tell this never before told story, because no one else was telling it, as he just mentioned. And the fact that a small group of activists managed to get up to 30 million people on the streets on such a global scale on the same day is incredible, especially because it happened, you know, before Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram existed. I think a lot of people forget how amazing that is. I mean, the fact that that demonstration still holds the record of the amount of people that demonstrated on the street on the same day is amazing, you know, before social media existed. So I think for me, that was really important. And a lot of people who've seen the film since have come up to us and said, you know, we didn't realize. I mean, I had demonstrated on a different day, I believe, in San Francisco, and I lived there. And most people in different cities just thought it was happening in their city and a few other places. So a lot of people didn't realize how global and massive it was. And I think, you know, the fact that it's been documented in We Are Many lets people know that, you know, it was much bigger than mainstream media ever wanted to let us know, basically.
Thanks so much, Wael. So Colleen, now for you. Now you're one of the featured participants in the movie, and then carry an important piece of the narrative. Looking back, what do you see as the special contribution of your voice within the film, and more importantly, your activism as a family member within the larger anti-war movement of which you were a part? I know it's a very big question, but if you could, you know, walk us through some of the essentials.
She's muted. Sorry, you're muted, Colleen.
Thank you. You'd think we'd have enough practice at doing this by now that I would not forget to unmute. So the protest happened on February 15th of 2003. And I think it is important to contextualize that day in the sense that the war in Iraq had really been building up for close to a year, for almost a year at that point. By the spring of 2002, it became fairly clear to people anyone paying attention that the winds were shifting. And this becomes important to Afghanistan later on and now. The winds were shifting from attention being turned from Afghanistan to Iraq. And so our organization, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, began working really hard, lobbying Congress, lobbying policymakers, and influencers, I guess as they're called now, are people who could influence policymakers about our opposition to any further harm, civilian harm anywhere, but also this notion that we had to respond to to things in a militaristic way, that we had somehow had to respond to the deaths of on 9/11 in such a militaristic, unimaginative, and unimpactful when it comes to solutions. So that was all happening in the summer and the fall of 2002. And in January of 2003, a group of 9/11 family members and others traveled to Iraq, myself included, specifically, as you mentioned earlier, Jeremy, specifically to add, if we could, to add the faces and the stories to the very real people who were being threatened. And our goal was to meet with civilians and to meet with Iraqis and to humanize people within a nation that had been characterized as part of an axis of evil. That these were real people, just like you and me and everyone who may be listening to this. So that trip happened for 10 days in the month of January. And then mid-February were these global protests against the impending war. And I guess the feeling was, gosh, you know, we organizationally, we have this position, and we sent a delegation, and the world is with us. Like, you know, the people of the world are with us. How could anything possibly happen? How could a war actually happen given the full display of the will of the people in the streets of February 15th? And so, you know, then we all know what happened. So I don't know what else to add except that to contextualize for those who don't remember, for those who were not around, who were very young, that this was kind of what was happening as the winds of war were blowing that year.
Thanks so much, Colleen. You know, I think it's worth saying that "Not in Our Name" became the most identifiable and important slogan of the global anti-war movement, right? So Bush was waging this war in the name of the security of all Americans, and in some sense, in the name of the 9/11 dead. And it was the families of the 9/11 dead, like Colleen and others, who were the first to promulgate "Not in Our Name" as the essence of that moral and human objection to war. And then it got picked up and translated into all kinds of publics all around the world. And then protesters were in some sense protesting in a benign sense in your name, echoing your message. And then that's a beautiful, almost magical solidarity that I think you all inspired and that the movie beautifully captures. I want to stay on the movie, picking up on the theme you just described, Colleen. There is this interesting structure to it where hope and expectation and excitement builds, and there's this rolling snowball gathering intensity and magnitude. And yet we all know the war is coming, right? So there's this lyrical sense, we are many, they are few. Surely the will of the few must bow to the will of the many, but that's not what happened. And as I think about it, the world can say no to war, but nothing obliged George Bush and Dick Cheney to listen to the world. And how, in aesthetic and sort of narrative terms, did you try to portray the moments of excitement and sort of crushing disappointment, building in a sense of how and why the war machine behaves the way it does, in defiance of the vox populi of the globe? So that's a question for you, Amir, and then we'll continue moving around.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, when I set out to make the film, initially it was just about the day. And you know, it was, you could say that it was going to be a film about a heroic failure. You know, did the protests stop the war? No, it didn't. Is it still worth telling the story of it? Yes, it is. I mean, you could make a kind of a sort of vague comparison with, you know, the making of the film about the Titanic. You know, we all know the Titanic sank, but people, you know, millions of people watch the film. They know what's going to happen, but they're still, you know. So when I set out to make it, it was just going to be that story. And then, but you know, we also know that films, all dramatic stories require drama and conflict. And what bigger conflict was there than this, you know, on the one hand, the millions of people, and on the other hand, this small number of protagonists who wanted to take us to war. So it sort of felt important and obvious to weave those stories in. And, you know, of course, and their narratives, you know, follow a similar timeline. And it was tricky to, you know, boil down the pro-war narrative into its bullet points. You know, that's why in the film there are all these date marks, and interweave that with the opposition to the war. But I think it worked, you know, really well. And of course, you know, depending on what side viewers are on, I'm hoping most of them were on the anti-war side. You're willing and wanting, and you're watching this emotional, you know, as you described it, this kind of hope and dreams and expectation that with these enormous numbers and with, you know, sort of justice on their side, and then set against the kind of palpable dishonesty of the war, that, you know, you're sort of swept along by it. And you kind of, although you know what's going to happen, you almost don't want to believe that it's going to happen until the two narratives collide, you know, a month apart, you know, the 15th of February taking place just a month before this, the invasion. And there's that moment where you think, surely it must have an impact, and surely they can't go to war after that. So in filmic terms, that was an extraordinary conflict to be able to bring onto the screen. But I think there has a political significance too, because it was the first time when millions of people, and by no means were they all regular protesters, many of them were first timers, were able to see in a very, very visible sense that disconnect between them and politicians. I mean, we can sometimes conceptualize that and intellectualize it, but here it was visible. You looked around, you thought, I've never seen a protest this big before. And then, you know, I think, Colleen, it was you, or it was someone in the film sort of said, you know, yes, it was. You said, you know, surely President Bush is watching, surely Tony Blair is watching. And they were watching and they didn't care. They called it a focus group, you know. And I certainly in the UK, I think it was a pivotal moment for British domestic politics, because it was the moment at which it was a very visible demonstration of, okay, so this is how it works. So this is what our voices mean. And it was the end of the Labour Party in this country. It was, you know, the death knell of Tony Blair, but we can talk about that. And many people, many young people especially, deserted politics. They went and set up their own movements, grassroots movement, horizontal movements, you know. And so that conflict between those two narratives had both a dramatic filmic purpose, but also the political significance of it was very obvious to people who participated and watched the film.
Terrific, thanks so much. And then, you know, the movie recreates the drama of the moment. It doesn't merely document it. And I think that's part of what makes it so powerful. Now, here's a question for Wael. In the West, especially, you know, the message of the protests was targeted at the war makers, Blair and Bush, but also to the people of Iraq and the people of the region more broadly, to say there are folks in the West who don't want this predatory, unnecessary war to, you know, victimize the region and its populace. And to the extent that you are aware, how did folks in the region take note of and receive these protests? And to the extent that you've been able to screen the movie in countries of the region, what has the response been to it?
That's a great question, Jeremy. You know, people we've talked with, and I grew up in the Middle East until I was 11, and I still have family in the Middle East, so I do come back and, you know, visit them. A lot of people, you know, were not aware until they watched the film, because some of these countries aren't allowed to protest, or really it's tough for them to be out there on the streets. And when they watched the film, many of them were kind of relieved and almost surprised that there were that many people in America, in the UK, in the West, so to speak, that were against the war. And I think that kind of really made it something, like they were excited that that many people in America, especially, I think, where, we often get the message in the Middle East, at least people do sometimes, where they feel like, America's targeting Muslims and Arabs in general and people in the Middle East. And I think for them, it was like a really eye-opening experience to see that many people in the West against the Iraq war. And, from then on, it also, motivated them to start protesting more whenever they could. And I think, they started kind of alliances with Western organizations as well, and I think so for me, that was like a great takeaway when we were able to screen the film in Dubai. And that was pretty amazing in itself because, at the time, the Dubai International Film Festival existed. And it was pretty amazing that they invited us to screen We Are Many there, because no film like that had ever been screened. And it was the conversations we had in the cinemas that showed the film during the festival were really amazing. I mean, people happened that there was support in the West against war and, invading Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries as well.
Great, thanks so much. And there's all kinds of unintended consequences in history. I mean, Amir, you're suggesting that with the Labour Party being discredited by the war, that opens the door for Brexit. No Iraq war, maybe you're still in the European Union. And then in the film, conceivably, there's also the suggestion that to the extent that Arab populations did mobilize, this helped lay the groundwork for the Arab Spring. And democratic expression in the West sort of migrated into the Arab world, leading to really social revolutions, albeit incomplete, in many countries in the region. And I love how the movie indicates all of these points of connection.
Yeah, in fact, that addresses a question that we were sort of talking about in the preamble before. How do you measure? What's the metric for the success of a move, of a protest or of a movement? If it's measured just on the basis of did it stop the war? No, but of course, I think we all probably would agree that movements are not necessarily just about that sort of immediate short-term result, but a longer term impact. And certainly what I didn't expect to find that link between the Western protests and the influence it had on the Egyptian protesters and so on. So that was a remarkable link for the film, but I suspect if one digs into other movements, one finds similar kinds of connections and influences in other events. So yes, with the UK, yeah, I mean, I really think the distrust, that breakdown in trust between the public and politicians, I think has never been regained. And I think a lot of commentators have remarked about how that was a moment. There was no going back after that. It was, whether it had connections, and some people have actually talked about connections between that and Brexit. It's open for debate, but certainly the distrust of politicians reached its kind of zenith there.
Great. So here's a lovely bridge to a question for Colleen, which pertains to the notion of how do we measure the success or failure of protests, right? And then obviously we pursue big policy goals like no war, but that doesn't exhaust the value of our work. And Peaceful Tomorrows, especially, along with Voices in the Wilderness, really privileges human-human connection, peace and reconciliation, journeys of growth, transformation, and healing. David Patorti speaks about that very eloquently in some of his essays. And I wonder, Colleen, could you speak to this less visible but often important dimension of the work of being a peacemaker as it's lived in your life and the lives of your Peaceful Tomorrow colleagues?
Yeah, that's a tall order, but I'll give it a shot. The work as a peacemaker. So to your question about the protest itself, and it didn't stop the war, does that diminish, does that have the ability to diminish my worth as a peacemaker? And I would argue strongly against that. I think of the racial justice movement and how long that movement has existed in the United States, and the setbacks and the one step forward and the three steps back. And if we decided, or an individual decides at some point, well, this setback, doesn't make it really lessens me and the work that I've been doing and all the struggle, it lessens the struggle. I can't fall into that cynicism, that type of cynicism, that I owe it to myself, I owe it to my family, I owe it to my community, and I owe it to everyone to continue to struggle for the world, a just and equitable world for everyone. So as a peacemaker, I feel like you can't measure one particular event, or in any kind of large movement. One event does not the movement make, or one setback does not the movement make. And peacemaking also is, I think of it really as a daily practice, that if I can't practice for the small things, yelling at someone when they cut me off when I'm driving, or interpersonal conflict with someone that I work with, let's say, if I can't help to resolve those things in my life, they're all practice points for the larger issues. And so every moment is potentially an opportunity to be a peacemaker in our individual lives and also collectively.
Thank you. That's a very beautiful answer, Colleen. We have one question from the audience I'll get to shortly, but let me move to some considerations of legacy. So we're at 20 years since 9/11. The United States had a very chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. A lot of pundits and smart people are saying that the war on terror and/or the 9/11 era has come to a close, and America and the world are ready for a new chapter. That's at least something you hear. Does it feel that way to you all? And let's start with Colleen. Nothing ever lasts forever, and 2021 is not 2010 or 2014. And yet it's not as though all of this stuff has just gone away.
Yeah, so the 20-year thing, of course, there's been a lot of thought and discussion about 20 years and what this means since 9/11, 2001. And I'd like to break this down kind of into two parts. One, kind of the legalities of the war. And people may not realize, but both the authorization for military force that was used to invade Afghanistan still exists. It's still on the books in Congress to this day, as is the 2002 authorization to use military force in Iraq that allowed for the invasion of Iraq. So when we think about 20 years later, what does this mean? We still have a legacy of war and military force as current policy for things that happened 19 and 20 years ago. So how do we change that? So that directly ties into the question of the American withdrawal that happened this past month from Afghanistan. We still have that authorization on the books. And I really, really wish there was a veteran. You know, I wish Vince could have joined us tonight, because to think about the human cost, certainly the civilian cost of these military interventions is astronomical. It's huge. One person's life is one person too much. But also to think about the loss of service members. You know, over 3,000 service members have been killed. I'm sorry, not 3,000, over 7,000 service members have been killed. And kind of peeking under the scab of war and the wounds of war, over 30,000 service members have killed themselves, have completed suicide since 9/11/2001. That is an unbearable cost for all of us to look at, to peer into that gaping wound. That type of loss should shock everyone's collective conscience. The other piece of this is much more personal. There is no one in jail to this day who's been convicted of murdering nearly 3,000 people on 9/11. There is no one who has been held accountable and convicted for the crime of murdering nearly 3,000 people. I find that, I just find that unfathomable. If my brother had been killed on a street corner 20 years ago, one would hope that there would be some sense of accountability. But because of politics, because there's so much involved to this, because of geopolitical calculations, certainly there's 5 men who've been accused, and they've been at Guantanamo since 2006 and in black sites for 4 years prior and tortured by the CIA. But the piece of this is about accountability, and how can we talk about the 20 years later when there's never been a full accounting of the crime that occurred? None, nor has there been any type of full accounting for what happened in response to that crime. I'm an American, so I can speak to the American response. So how was it that we invaded 2 countries and have now have drone strikes in countless other countries, some of which we don't even know about? How does that happen without accountability to the very American public that is sponsoring these types of interventions? So for me, the 20 years is to look at the whole big picture. The narrow focus of my brother's death is personally extremely important to me, but also important to the world and to my children and to all the children of the world is understanding what the heck went so wrong. How did we get it so wrong with so little care? The response to those crimes as well.
Thanks so much, Colleen. I'll ask Amir and Wael a different question, if I may. We're running towards the end of time. You know, let me just say that you point out that some people have the luxury of indulging the illusion that they can move on, and others sadly can't. Yourself, veterans, their families, those disabled, those with PTSD, victims of war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and so on. And then the men still at Guantanamo, which hasn't closed, right? And then now with the United States after Afghanistan, prima facie, there's no reason to hold them because the war in which they were being held is now officially over. But if Biden releases anybody, he'll look weak, and that's bad politically, right? And the politics is always what gets in the way of accountability and reckoning. And I imagine that will be the case for a long time to come until people have, you know, the courage to say enough. Okay, so we've gotten a wonderful question from the audience that's both for Wael and Amir, and I'll just read it verbatim. It says, among the many effects of 9/11 in the United States especially is the othering of Muslims and or the citizens of Middle Eastern countries. To what degree have your own countries of origin, and Amir, I believe you said you're from Iran originally, and Wael, you grew up initially in Saudi Arabia, to what degree of your own countries of origin influence your wish to make this film or your broader perspective on the politics of the war on terror in the UK?
You know, it's interesting. Well, it's a great question. And I don't know that I haven't really thought my origin influenced me that much. I've been here since the, age of 9. My own instincts are, whether you call them pacifist or anti-war, let's call it anti-war, are there. It's worth saying that, as long as I've been in the UK, Britain has been pretty much almost constantly at war with somewhere. So I came to the UK in the late 70s, and shortly after that, it was, the Falklands War. Not long after that, it was, Afghanistan War 1, then, and of course, Iran-Iraq War, in which Britain and America supplied and had both of them, against each other. So there was that war. Then there were a whole series of wars under Tony Blair, Afghanistan too, Iraq too. So, it's hard also to escape the conclusion that, Britain goes to war fairly easily against Islamic countries. So there's, but I don't think actually any of those things really, influenced me. I just saw in front of me something that I participated in. And honestly, the first thing was, as a filmmaker, this is an interesting story. It happened to also coincide with my views that it was an unjust and illegal war. But, I'm Iranian, and this was a war against Iraq. I just thought it was unjust. And also, just to pick up on the very end of what Colleen was saying, talking about 20 years and how things could have gone so wrong. What's fascinating is to reading the journalism that's going on right now, is that none of it pretty much couches those wars in terms of they were wrong or unjust. Most of the commentary by commentators and by the participants themselves, is couched as, we had the best of intentions. We were good guys. We were going in there for the right reasons. It just didn't go out so well. And then some of them are saying, and our mistake is not that we went in. Our mistake is that we didn't stay the course. We didn't execute it properly. We didn't Tony Blair, just a few days ago, said, we need more boots on the ground. And we need not to lose the will, the stomach to fight. I mean, I could show you headlines of major commentators here saying, if we in the West lose the stomach to fight, and one of them even said, if we're not going to be the policeman of the world, who is? So, people have learned nothing, literally nothing, which again addresses, kind of why we need to make this film. I still don't understand why it is that in both our societies, the work of people like Colleen and other movements is sort of viewed as this sort of slightly kind of airy-fairy, marginal thing. And we privilege the muscular militarism of commentators and so on. And everybody else who opposes war are kind of just, hippies and unrealistic and soft and I don't know, pro our enemies. I still cannot understand that,
Right, and that bias exists even when the majority of the country ends up agreeing with the airy-fairy hippies. I mean,
right.
But they're still sort of rendered invisible and ridiculed. So Wael, your own response to that question?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I was born in Damascus, and as you mentioned, I grew up in Saudi Arabia until I was 11. Since then, I've lived in Switzerland, California, the UK, Montreal, and the Czech Republic. And so I've always been I never really felt like my background really had that much to do with wanting to support Amir with the film. I happened to be in London at the time, working on my own film, and it was just the right time, and it felt like the right story. I mean, I think my values, being anti-war, wanting to actually really bridge a gap that I sometimes still feel between the East and the West about the fact that many of us have the same values. Many of us are anti-war. Many of us, believe in, this kind of takes me back to what Colleen was talking about and Amir ended with. I think, one of the main messages of the film for me is that every single voice and individual protester can make a difference. The more people, obviously, that come together against wars, corruption, violence, racism, homophobia, illegal occupation, etc., the more we will see, positive change. I think for me, We Are Many is also a reminder that even though we live in an instant gratification culture and often want change to happen, at the speed of light, so to speak, activism needs persistence and some patience for real change to occur. I mean, I think the main thing is to keep coming back. And that's why I'm actually very grateful to Colleen and her organization. I have so much respect for September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And I'm really glad that we are associated with them, and thank them for inviting us to screen the film and to be part of this panel, because I think it's working together that really makes the difference. And I think, I don't want to give the ending of the film away, but the fact that we didn't have enough money initially to finish the film kind of worked in our favor, because something pretty amazing happened politically and voting wise. And it's just another example of, some of these movements take 5 to 10 years before change happens. So even though we couldn't stop the imminent war on Iraq, another war was stopped at the time. And a lot of that is because of people like Colleen and their organizations. All that work pays off at some point. It's a roller coaster being an activist. Colleen knows all about it. And it's like you are going to go up and down, and you're going to have you're going to win some battles and you're going to lose others. And that's the way it is,
Right, thank you. Beautifully said. And one of Peaceful Tomorrow's virtues is stamina and persistence. All these years later, still at this, indefatigably. Most 9/11 families groups have since folded, and there were a bunch, advocating around all kinds of interests. So we have, I think, a lovely question to conclude on, which is somewhat practical. How can your film, coupled with activist voices such as Colleen's, be used in classrooms? I should say that I have had Colleen address one of my classes. I had Phyllis Rodriguez do the same. They were both, wonderful participants that added, so much to the curriculum. I know that they're perpetually available for events like this. So I wonder if Colleen could say a little bit more about your ongoing public-facing work. And then for Wael and Amir, how can educators, whether it's a peace community or a formal school, make use of your film and then reach out to you all if you're available? Mm-hmm. So why don't you start, Colleen?
Sure. The question about how this can be used as educating, for one of our members for years, he was a high school teacher in Brooklyn, and he set up a formal relationship with a high school in Baghdad, where the two high schools communicated before the war started, and then once it was much shakier afterwards, but continue that relationship and just helping young people, to your point about educating young people from different parts of the world, understand a lot of their commonalities and some of their differences. And just, again, it comes back to humanizing. And it comes back to this notion of civilian protection is much more immediate when, boy, I know this person there and who might be harmed. The point about educating, I am super, super grateful for a film like We Are Many. It shows it concretely what actually happened. And we're living in a time where truth has been so bendable lately. I feel for young people who, especially to you, Jeremy, a history professor, what is history? What really happened? And there are true factual events that happened. And it's a true fact that millions of people on February 15th, 2003 took it upon themselves to voice their dissent to an impending war. That's remarkable, and thank you for documenting that truth occurred. It really has struck me over the past few years, particularly here in the States, how imperative it is that there's that type of kind of a treasure for educators to go to.
Great. So we'll let the filmmakers, Wael and Amir, have the last word. How can your film be accessed, and how can it be given new life?
Yeah, well, just to pick up on what Colleen was saying. Well, firstly, the practical aspect is obviously it's available digitally, and we'd love it if schools and universities and colleges show it, and if we can be of help and service in any way, we'd love to do that. I think the importance of it is, if I look at, for example, in the UK, in terms of what students are taught just about British colonial history and empire, I mean, nothing, literally nothing. You can go through entire school years and learn nothing about the devastating impact of the British Empire and colonialism on parts of the world. They get to learn about the 2 world wars, and we built railways in India. Similarly with Iraq, there could be many children growing up who just learn nothing. I don't know what they teach them in America about the Iraq War. Certainly here, I don't think they get taught much about that, the generation that have grown up since. I'm sorry we didn't get to touch on the cultural comparisons between Vietnam and Iraq, and how popular culture memorializes and these wars. But certainly, I think in the absence of cultural products, or enough of them, films like this, I hope, will fill the gap that maybe doesn't exist in standard school education and university education, so that people can look at it and, as Colleen said, go, wow, this actually happened, and here are the pictures. In the age of fake news, you can't make that up. So I really hope that it will be used as widely as possible. And if all goes well in 2023, we'd like to, I was hoping to be in America to go on college tours and cinemas and so on. COVID killed that, but maybe in 2023, for the 20th anniversary of the protest, we can come back and show the film in cinemas and in universities and schools and so on. So more power to both of you.
Terrific. Do you have anything to add, Wael?
Yeah, I mean, apart from the very important historical factor of having it available for educators and at universities and even high schools, I think it's also very current. I think, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter slogan and movement actually credits the global demonstration that's in our film, We Are Many, for being her first global demonstration. And so it really kind of started a lot of movements, according to people we've talked with or, read interviews by. And I think, a lot of people like, why is this film significant now? It's very significant because many of the movements, were somewhat touched by this global demonstration. And when they realized that it did make a difference, that's what's magical for me about the film, is when you watch the end of the film, you realize that, yes, again, we couldn't stop the Iraq War. The activists did manage to stop other things from happening. And I think that's really important in the context of current movements, and people not giving up in fighting for things they believe in. And so in that sense, I think it's got the historical, but it's also got the current factor. And unfortunately, these things are going to keep happening. And I think films like We Are Many are important to show people that there is something you can do about it.
Great, that's a wonderful note to close on. On behalf of all the panelists, we'd like to thank the organizers of the Film Fest. Terry Green of Peaceful Tomorrows did a lot of important work behind the scenes, as did others. This is a great advertisement for the film if you haven't seen it. If you have, watch it again, use it in your classroom. Just a lovely conversation, and I hope we all stay in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jeremy.
everybody.
Thank you.